What if the one weapon Iran was counting on to bring the world to its knees just quietly disappeared, and almost nobody noticed? Somewhere under the water, near one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth, a threat that took years to build was erased in a matter of weeks, and hardly anyone outside a small circle of analysts even realized it happened. Before we go any further, if you care about understanding what's really happening in the world instead of just scrolling past it, hit that subscribe button like you're locking in a front row seat. Tap like if you want more of this, and send this video to one person who still thinks this story is just background noise. Because it isn't. This is one of the biggest military stories nobody is talking about, and by the end of this video, you will understand it better than most analysts on television. Let's start with the map, because you cannot understand this story without understanding the geography first. There is a stretch of water called the Strait of Hormuz. Iran sits on one side. Oman and the United Arab Emirates sit on the other. At its tightest point, this strait is only about 21 miles wide. That's it. 21 miles of water standing between the world and roughly a fifth of all the oil it uses every single day. Somewhere between 6 and 10 million barrels pass through this narrow gap daily. Oil from Saudi Arabia, oil from Iraq, oil from Kuwait, natural gas from Qatar. All of it has to squeeze through this one corridor before reaching ships bound for Japan, South Korea, Europe, and everywhere else that runs on energy. Here's the part that makes this strait so dangerous. There's no shortcut around it. You cannot build a pipeline big enough to replace it. You cannot send tankers around the long way without adding weeks to every trip and driving up costs everywhere. This tiny stretch of water is basically an economic pressure point for the entire planet. And for years, Iran has known this. They understood that just by sitting next to this door, they had power that had nothing to do with the size of their economy or their military budget. All they had to do was threaten to shut the door, and the whole world would feel it within days. Think about how strange that is for a moment. Iran's economy is a fraction of the size of the countries that depend on this waterway. Its military, while not small, is nowhere close to matching the navies of the countries whose oil passes through this strait every day. And yet, for decades, this single geographic accident, being right next to a narrow channel that the whole planet depends on, gave Iran a kind of leverage that money and weapons alone never could. That is the entire foundation of everything we're about to talk about. That threat mostly rested on one simple, terrifying tool: sea mines. Now, when most people hear that word, they picture something old and clunky, something from a black and white war movie, a rusty metal ball with spikes bobbing on the surface of the ocean. Forget that image completely. Modern naval mines are quiet, patient, and shockingly intelligent. Some of them wait to be physically struck by a ship's hull, but the more advanced ones don't need contact at all. They sit on the sea floor or hover just above it, and they listen. They can sense the magnetic field of a passing ship. They can pick up the exact sound signature of a propeller. They can feel the pressure wave pushed out by a massive tanker moving thousands of tons of water. When everything matches what they're programmed to look for, they explode on their own. Nobody has to touch them. They find their target. And here's the nightmare for any navy trying to keep a waterway open. You don't know where these things are unless you search for them, inch by inch, meter by meter across a sea floor that's often muddy, cluttered, and full of natural junk that can look exactly like a mine on a sonar screen. A rock, a piece of old debris, a shipwreck fragment. Any of these can trigger a false alarm, and any one of them could also be hiding the real thing underneath a thin layer of sediment. It is slow, it is dangerous, and it is exactly the kind of uncertainty Iran was hoping to create, because uncertainty alone can shut down shipping lanes just as effectively as an actual explosion. During the height of recent tensions, Iranian forces used small, fast boats to slip mines into the water along this strait. These boats are hard to spot from the air and even harder to track at night. They move quickly, blend in with normal fishing and patrol traffic, and can drop a mine into the water in a matter of seconds. By the time things had escalated, there were reportedly more than 100 of these objects sitting somewhere in that waterway, waiting to be found before any tanker could safely pass through. Now here comes the part of this story that is almost too strange to believe. Iran lost track of where they put them. Think about that for a second. This is a regime that just planted weapons in the most important shipping lane on the planet, weapons designed to threaten global oil supply as leverage in a conflict, and then couldn't even keep an accurate record of where they put them. It's like burying treasure in your own backyard and losing the map to your own hiding spots, except this treasure explodes under ships carrying 200,000 tons of crude oil. It's the kind of mistake that sounds almost comedic until you remember how many lives and how much of the global economy depended on getting it right. There was actually an agreement signed earlier this year, sometimes called the Islamabad Memorandum, where Iran committed to removing the very mines they had placed. And then they simply didn't do it. Not because they refused outright, but because According to officials who spoke with major news outlets, they didn't have the technology, the resources, or frankly, the internal organization to locate and safely remove what they had scattered across the sea floor. That tells you almost everything you need to know about the level of competence running that operation. A country that can plant a threat but cannot undo it is a country whose bluff is far weaker than it wants the world to believe. So the United States Navy stepped in. And what they did next is genuinely one of the more remarkable military operations in recent memory. 3 separate layers of technology worked together, from the sky, on the surface, and deep underwater, and not a single human diver had to enter that dangerous water. Let's walk through each layer slowly, because every single piece of this operation matters, and together they tell a story about how warfare itself is changing right in front of us. Let's start at the top. In the air, helicopters equipped with a laser detection system flew low grid patterns over the water. Instead of a single beam of light, the system fires rapid pulses down into the water and reads what bounces back to build a complete 3-dimensional picture of everything beneath the surface, all the way down through the water column. Floating mines, mines hovering at mid-depth, even mines drifting just under the surface, almost invisible to the naked eye. And the incredible part is that the helicopter never has to stop or hover. It builds this 3-dimensional map while flying forward at normal speed, covering miles of water in hours instead of days. That speed matters enormously when you're racing against a threat sitting in the world's most important shipping lane. Because every extra day a strait stays uncertain as another day tankers wait, another day oil prices twitch, another day the global economy holds its breath. Once that aerial picture was built, the next layer took over on the surface. This is where things start to sound like science fiction, except it's completely real. Unmanned surface vessels, essentially robot boats, move through the water carrying different equipment depending on the job. Some of them towed advanced sonar systems capable of scanning the sea floor, the water column, and everything in between in a single pass, catching mines hidden in the mud as well as ones floating higher up. These boats don't get tired. They don't need rest breaks. They can run the same search pattern over and over with perfect consistency, something no human crew could ever match after hours of exhausting, high-stakes work. But one particular tool stood out because of how clever it is. Some of these robot boats towed a system that drags a magnetic cable while generating specific acoustic sounds. Together, this creates a fake signature, the electronic ghost of a massive warship that isn't actually there. To an influenced mind listening for exactly this kind of signal, it looks like the real thing. So the mine triggers, it detonates on an empty patch of water where no ship, no crew, and no real target ever existed. The mine is destroyed and nobody gets hurt. It's essentially tricking a weapon into wasting itself on a shadow, turning the mine's own intelligence against it. The very feature that made these mines so dangerous, their ability to sense and react on their own, became the exact weakness that let them be destroyed safely from a distance. Then comes the third layer, and honestly, this is the part that should give you chills. Deep beneath the surface, roughly 90 feet down, an underwater drone shaped like a small torpedo moved slowly and carefully along the seafloor, running detailed sonar scans just a couple of meters above the mud. It was hunting for shapes that didn't quite belong, objects that looked almost like rocks, but were a little too round, a little too symmetrical, a little too perfectly placed. Because that's exactly where the smartest minds end up. Not floating where a helicopter can spot them easily, but sitting half buried in the sediment, patient and hidden, waiting for months if necessary. The underwater drone found them anyway, moving in careful, methodical lines, like someone mowing a lawn they cannot see, trusting nothing but the sonar picture building up in front of them. It built a precise picture of every object, marked the exact coordinates, and handed that information over so each one could be safely dealt with, either destroyed remotely or handled by trained explosive disposal teams working from the information the drone provided. By combining all 3 layers, the sky, the surface, and the sea floor, the Navy located more than 100 of these dangerous objects. And through this entire operation, not one American diver had to swim near a live mine. That is not a small detail. That is the whole point. For decades, mine clearance meant sending human beings into direct contact with weapons built to kill. This operation proved that story doesn't have to be true anymore. For a long time, clearing mines meant something very different. There used to be ships specifically built for this job, constructed from wood and fiberglass instead of metal, specifically so their hulls wouldn't trigger the magnetic mines waiting beneath them. Their crews had a nickname that says everything about how dangerous the job was. They called themselves Iron Men in wooden ships because the mission demanded raw courage combined with painstaking patience. You had to sail slowly through a minefield, hunting each weapon individually, knowing that one mistake could be the last one you ever made. Every single pass through the water was a test of nerve as much as skill. Those older ships have now been retired. So has the type of helicopter that used to specialize in exactly this kind of mission. In their place, stands this new system of drones and robots, tested for real, not in a training exercise, not in a simulation, but in an actual minefield inside one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. And it worked. The old tools, built on human courage and slow, careful nerve, have been replaced by machines that never feel fear and never need rest. That is not a small shift. That is a complete rewriting of what mine warfare looks like going forward. Now, before we go deeper into what this all means, let's pause for a second. If you're the kind of person who actually wants to understand the world instead of just reacting to headlines, this channel is exactly where you should be. Ring the notification bell so you never miss the next piece of this story. Drop a comment telling me one thing you learned so far. And if you're new here, welcome, because this is only the beginning of what's coming. Now let's talk about why this matters so much more than most people realize. Iran's entire strategy in this conflict rested on one core threat. Push us too far, and we close Hormuz. We mine the strait. We hold the global economy hostage until the pain becomes too much for everyone else to bear. This threat has worked as a deterrent for decades, not because Iran necessarily wanted to use it, but because everyone knew how expensive and dangerous it would be to clear a minefield in contested waters. Iran never actually needed the mines to sink a single ship. They just needed the world to believe those mines were there, waiting, uncertain, unpredictable. That uncertainty alone was enough to slow tankers, spike oil prices, and force nervous phone calls between world leaders sitting thousands of miles away from the strait itself. That is exactly the threat the United States just dismantled, methodically, publicly, and with technology, Iran has no way of matching. The political weapon behind the mines has been taken apart piece by piece, and Iran knows it. This wasn't just a military operation. It was a message, delivered slowly and precisely, that the old rules no longer apply. Following the operation, an official announcement confirmed that mines had been removed or safely destroyed throughout the international waters of the strait. But there was something else in that message that mattered even more than the clearance itself. Iran was formally warned that any vessel caught placing new mines in that waterway would be destroyed immediately. On top of that, satellite surveillance is now watching that stretch of water around the clock, day and night, with no gaps and no blind spots. Pause on that for a second, because this isn't just a statement about what already happened. It's a warning about what happens if Iran tries it again. It is a boundary drawn using satellites, aircraft, and constant surveillance, and the message could not be clearer. There is zero tolerance now for mining that strait. Try it, and the boat responsible will be found and destroyed almost immediately, not after weeks of diplomatic back and forth, not after a slow-moving international resolution. That is the new reality, and it's backed up by a demonstrated ability to follow through, because the same operation that cleared the mines also proved the surveillance and response system actually works. Now, some people have pointed out that the Navy only cleared the actual shipping lanes rather than the entire strait from coast to coast. That's true, but it misses the point entirely. Inside that strait, there is a specific traffic pattern, one lane going in, one lane going out, each about 2 miles wide with a buffer zone in between. That narrow strip is where the actual ships travel. A fully loaded oil tanker carrying 200,000 tons of crude cannot swerve at the last second if it spots something suspicious in the water. It needs miles just to slow down, let alone change direction. So the mission was never about scrubbing every inch of the seafloor from shore to shore. The mission was about guaranteeing that specific corridor the actual road ships use was completely safe. And that corridor is now clear. Mines sitting closer to Iran's own coastline, in waters no responsible tanker captain would ever sail through anyway, are simply not part of the real operational picture. Clearing them would be like sweeping every inch of a parking lot when all you actually need is the road leading in and out of it. Now, let's talk about what's happening inside Iran, because the economic story here is just as important as the military one. Iran's currency has been in a genuine free fall. At one point recently, it took over 2 million of their currency units just to buy a single American dollar. Compare that to earlier this year, when the exchange rate was roughly a quarter of that number. In just a few months, the currency lost somewhere around 75% of its value. That is not a currency under mild pressure. That is an economy being hollowed out in real time, month after month, in front of everyone watching. And you can see the cracks starting to show. Footage circulating online shows people in Iranian cities speaking more openly than they would have dared even a year ago. The government's tight control over information inside the country is slipping, little by little, video by video. The economic pain is landing on ordinary families, not on the military commanders who have their own financial networks shielding them from the worst of it, but on shopkeepers, teachers, engineers, and parents just trying to buy groceries and pay rent with a currency that keeps losing value by the week. Imagine watching your savings shrink, not over years, but over months, while state television keeps insisting everything is under control. That pressure doesn't fade away. It builds. And a government that can't stabilize its economy, can't demonstrate real military strength, and can't even keep track of the weapons it planted in its own neighboring waters, is running out of convincing stories to tell its own people. There's only so long you can tell a population that things are fine while their money buys less every single week. One senior Iranian security official recently went on state television and promised what he called a seismic response to American economic pressure, insisting that not a single drop of oil would leave the region. Meanwhile, millions of barrels were still moving through that exact strait every single day while he was speaking. There's always a gap between what gets said for domestic audiences and what's actually happening on the ground. But that gap is getting harder and harder to hide, especially when your own citizens are watching their savings disappear in real time while the oil tankers keep sailing past exactly as before. So what does Iran actually have left? It's worth being honest here rather than dismissing them entirely, because underestimating a cornered opponent is always a mistake. They still have fast attack boats built around swarming tactics, using large numbers of small, heavily armed vessels to try to overwhelm bigger ships in tight waters. They still have connections to armed groups across the region who could stir up trouble and complicate the picture without Iran ever having to act directly. They still have a missile arsenal that, while weakened by recent strikes, hasn't disappeared completely. And they still have the human factor, the possibility that a cornered regime decides that doing something reckless feels safer than doing nothing at all. History is full of examples of exactly that kind of desperate decision-making. Moments when leaders facing collapse chose escalation simply because standing still felt like losing anyway. Which is why the right response here isn't celebration. It's steady, quiet vigilance. Keep the surveillance running nonstop. Keep the aircraft on standby. Keep watching every boat that leaves an Iranian port from the moment it moves. Because a threat doesn't disappear the moment a press release goes out. It disappears when every possible path toward aggression is being watched, tracked, and ready to be answered instantly. That is exactly the kind of network being built in the region right now. Not an army of occupation, but a web of constant observation designed to make any act of aggression too costly to even attempt. The goal isn't to punish Iran after the fact. It's to make the entire idea of trying something reckless feel pointless before it even starts. And here's the bigger picture worth sitting with for a moment. What just happened in that strait wasn't just about Iran. It was the first real large-scale proof that a fully unmanned system for clearing mines actually works in a live, high-stakes environment. Not a controlled test, not a demonstration for cameras. A genuine minefield and a genuine strategic choke point, with real tankers waiting to pass through, real money on the line, and real consequences if something went wrong. And it worked exactly as designed. Think about what that means for the future. The hardest part of mine warfare has always been the human cost. Divers swimming near live explosives. Crews spending weeks sailing painfully slow patterns through waters that could kill them without warning. That risk has always limited how quickly a navy could act, and how willing commanders were to even attempt it under pressure. Take the human element out of that equation, and the entire calculation changes. Machines don't get exhausted. They don't feel fear. They don't need to be pulled out after hours underwater. You can keep running search patterns around the clock, swapping batteries and pushing forward without ever putting a person in danger. That means faster results, dramatically lower risk, and a completely different political calculation. If clearing a minefield no longer requires sending sailors into harm's way, then the political cost of doing it drops significantly. And that means the entire value of using mines as a threat drops right along with it. Every other navy watching this operation, and there are many, just learned the same lesson Iran is learning the hard way. The era of using cheap sea mines as leverage against a technologically superior opponent is closing fast, and it may never fully open again. Before we wrap this up, one more thing. If this video helped you actually understand something you'd only seen in confusing headlines before, do me a favor and share it with someone else who deserves the same clarity. That's the real reason channels like this exist, to cut through the noise. All right, let's finish this. So where does this leave things? Iran walked into this conflict holding what it believed was its strongest card, the ability to threaten the world's oil supply by holding the Strait of Hormuz hostage. That card is gone now, not because of a massive bombing campaign, not because of political collapse, but because a combination of aerial lasers, robotic boats, and underwater drones methodically dismantled the threat faster and more completely than anyone in Tehran expected, and then backed it up with a promise that any attempt to repeat it would be answered immediately. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil still flows through that narrow stretch of water every single day, and what just happened there sent an unmistakable message about whose terms that oil flows under going forward. This isn't a story that ends with one headline and fades away. It's a shift that reshapes how this entire region operates from here on out, enforced by systems that never sleep, never blink, and never need to rest. The real question now is what comes next. Does Iran try to rebuild this threat in some other form? Do their fast attack boats start pushing harder in the water? Does pressure shift toward proxy groups elsewhere in the region to create a different kind of disruption? These are the moves still sitting on the table for a government that just watched its most powerful piece of leverage get taken off the board entirely, with no clear way to get it back. If you want to keep following exactly how this unfolds, this is the channel to stick around for. Smash that subscribe button, drop a comment with your prediction on what Iran does next, and share this video with someone who needs to actually understand this instead of just seeing a headline scroll by. This story is far from over, and I'll be right here breaking down every next move as it happens.